Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome everyone and good evening. Welcome to Muslim Council of Britain's The Next Level webinar series, a space that goes beyond conversation. Each session, alhamdulillah, as you know, we invite um, guests to unpack, challenge, and inspire, inshallah. We expect honest dialogue, diverse perspective, fearless conversation, inshallah, with thought leaders, change makers, and voices from all walks of society, inshallah. So this evening or our next level webinar isn't just about discussion, it's a movement, inshallah, that pushes us towards understanding, unity, and a meaningful change. Tonight, we explore how stories shape identity, belonging, and a collective memory. Through powerful books and conversation with Muslim thinkers and writers, will challenge dominant narratives, uncover forgotten histories, and reimagine who we are and who we can become. Together, we'll confront reality and think about how to move from awareness to action, from conversation to changes, inshallah. Just a little bit of housekeeping for those of you that have joined us for the first time. Please do use the chat function. There's a Q&A function to write your question as we go along, or you can use the chat function to leave your question in advance as we're talking. At the end, we will try and answer some of the questions. Apologies, we may not be able to answer all the questions as we have limited time, but we'll have enough time, inshallah, to try our best to answer some of the questions. This webinar is being recorded. So we will then upload it on our YouTube. So please do subscribe to our Muslim Council of Britain YouTube channel, inshallah. And then you'll be updated when this is uploaded. Tonight, webinar is proudly sponsored by Cube Publishing. Inspired by our Islamic faith, Cube Publishing is committed to serving Muslim communities worldwide by publishing innovative, relevant, and authentic books. In today's ever-changing world, Cube seeks to enable spiritual, cultural, intellectual, and creative expression in ways that are engaging and exciting, traditional and modern, catering for all young and old. So do check out their website. We will certainly put that on our chat function. So check out Cube, our sponsors. And as mentioned earlier, we always get a question around where can we find this recording? We put that on the chat. Without any further ado, I know you're all waiting. We're thrilled to have our guest with us, Brother Tariq Hussain. Thank you for coming along. We really appreciate your
Thank you
time
for
and
having
really
me.
excited to
Assalamu
have
alaikum.
you on our webinar. Just a little bit of before we go in, it's going to be a conversation for those that are watching at home, inshallah. We want to have a natural conversation. We want to get you involved and find out about yourself and more about the book. So we've got a few questions to start warming you up, inshallah, and then we will delve into it. Just a little bit introduction for those of you that don't know about Tariq. Tariq is an award-winning author, travel writer, historian, as a journalist specializing in Muslim heritage culture and identity, especially in Europe and beyond. We'll be talking about his podcast, his book just recently launched last week, Muslim Europe, a journey in search of a 1400-year history. Subhanallah, we'll discuss that more. But his previous travel history book, Minarets in the Mountain, a journey into Muslim Europe, explores living Muslim heritage and communities in the Balkans and beyond. It was long listed in the 2021 Bala Gifford Prize and won the 2022 Adil Evan Awards for the best travel narrative. Mashallah. He's also obviously written for various leading media and travel publishers, from guidebooks for Lonely Planet, as well as articles on the BBC, National Geographic, and others. Beyond writing, he helped create Britain's Muslim First Heritage Trail in Woking, and is a fellow at Centre of Religion and Heritage at the University of Groningen. I can't even pronounce that, Groningen.
Don't worry,
Um,
I still can't pronounce it, and I'm a
Groningen.
fellow there.
I don't even know where that is anyway. We can have a
It's in
discussion
the
about that.
Netherlands. It's in the
So,
Netherlands.
it's in the Netherlands. We're very fortunate to have you. So, thank you for joining
MashaAllah.
us today. Really, really appreciate your time, inshallah. First and foremost, I thought let's break the ice a little bit for those that are at home. Um, let's start by I want to know what inspired you to start writing. What was it that got you into, this is what I want to be when I grow up or in the future?
Right. Okay. So we'll try and keep this as natural as possible, given that the internet connection seems to
Yeah.
be awful tonight. So if there is a delayed response, do forgive me to everyone that's listening. I guess when I look at my childhood, we're talking here about books that are now deemed maybe a little bit controversial, but everyone of a certain age will remember people like Tintin, the Boy Reporter, Asterix and Obelix going off on adventures, and all the Enid Blyton books about the Secret Seven and the Famous Five, and those books really kind of I would spend hours in Bethnal Green Library where I grew up, and it was Tintin that really, I think, that I used to really imagine myself as being this reporter that went on these crazy adventures across the globe. Maybe not as scary and as dangerous as his ones are made out to be, where he has a near death experience in
Yeah.
every single episode, but just that kind of
Yeah.
joy of being out there. And then, of course, as I got older, I began to read more of the kind of travel literature that inspired me so much. And I still read a lot of it. Well, less so now. People like William Dalrymple when he was writing travel, Bill Bryson, all of these kinds of very popular travel writers of the time. But certainly Dalrymple left a massive impression on me, purely because of his writing style. It's not a surprise that he's now transitioned, or was always a historian maybe, who wrote about travel, because that's what I loved about his way of writing, is that he would weave in this very dense, very complex history, but with the lightest of touches. And I realized very, very quickly that I was very receptive to that history when it was written in that style, and I imagined other people
Mm.
would be as well. So that's probably a way to say that's a direct segue. Now, in terms of, as a Muslim, of course, there was really nobody in that landscape.
Yeah.
And it was only when I came across some long dead travelers who are a little bit more famous now because, we have the internet, the digital age, and we have lots of memes on our phones. But people like Ibn Battuta, coming across
I
him
was
and
going
the
to say Ibn
writing of Tim
Battuta.
Mackin. Yeah, and the writing of Tim Mackintosh Smith, who translated Battuta, of course, and made it accessible to the English-speaking language. This is what I think really felt like, a pivotal moment for me, because the realization that it wasn't just a certain demographic. Even Tintin was white. William Dalrymple's white, Bill
Yeah.
Bryson's white. I'm naming these people deliberately, but it was only when I came across the likes of Battuta that I realized not only could I do this, but we had done this for so long as Muslims. The Rihla tradition, most of the people who are online now, some of whom don't know who I am, but will know who Ibn Battuta is clearly, will appreciate that this is the world that Muslim travelers and travel writers were a part of once upon a time. And that was a huge moment.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. Like I used to love Tintin and the cartoon Mozo and his dog, and the captain always used to get in trouble. And
Yeah,
those are the
Captain
good
Haddock.
times. And you mentioned William Dalrymple, another fan. At the moment, I'm currently listening to the Empire podcast. I know his Anarchy book is one of those books you probably are mentioning. So someone about who's the author, writer, William Dalrymple, do search him. Amazing historian and a storyteller. Like you said, I love the way he tells the story and the narrative,
Mhm.
and his knowledge is definitely, and I love how all that, as well as Ibn Battuta, has also inspired you around traveling and so on. What were your first kind of book? How did you first think, you know what, I'm going to write this book around traveling? Or what was your first kind of book
I
writing?
guess because I emerged out of like I was a journalist very early on
Yeah,
in my life, and so I
yeah,
developed a love for writing clearly very, very early on. Then I was
yeah.
a teacher for a long time, and it was really, in this book, for anybody who's listening or tuned in today who may have already bought it now and may have begun reading it, they will know the pivotal moment, because I describe it in the book. It arrives when I'm leaving Europe and Britain, thinking, this is pre-internet, this is pre-digital age in the way that we're experiencing it now, and I'm imagining that we don't belong here. I'm buying into all this post 9/11 nonsense that we thought was unusual
Mm,
then, and of course now is just normal for us. And it's the quote unquote discovery, for me anyway. Obviously this place was always there. It's the discovery by myself inadvertently of a mausoleum on the very edge of Europe, in which it is reputedly the final resting place of actually, an actual relative of the Prophet, which completely blew my mind, because here I was thinking that Muslims have no history in Europe. And suddenly I'm told the first generation, the Sahaba, the actual family of the Prophet, came to Europe. And so that was a pivotal moment. That was the moment I thought, I'm going to write a book. I mean, I always dreamt of writing a book. When you're a writer, you always dream of writing a book. But I never knew what book it was. And, there are drafts of books that never made it. But it was really engaging more with the travel genre that I realized that this was the vehicle through which I wanted to tell this history. And of course, my current book is positioned as history, because we felt, my editor and I felt like it was more than travel, but also actually it's not entirely history either. This is why it's making some reviewers a little bit uncomfortable, because they're reviewing it purely as a history book, but actually it's a cultural commentary as well. The reason the subtitle says it's a journey in search of a 1400-year history is because I'm not telling you the entire 1400-year history. That would be impossible for one person to do first.
Yeah.
I'm also telling you about what happens on that journey and what else I discover, as well as the history. So there's a lot of exciting history in there, but actually, and we can get onto this later, some of the most significant aspects of the book, which begin to emerge in my first one, is the impact of the void that we are talking about here in Europe's history. And I think that is the most pressing thing in this day and age.
Do you feel like the narrative that we are taught in curriculum in school around, like obviously in school we're taught history, it starts with the Roman Empire and then we then jump the gun and so on. Is that what's missing, and is that something that you want to try and help feel, making sure the reader and the audience have a better understanding of us as Muslim who are playing a pivotal part from 1400 years ago, or is that something that you want people to delve into a lot more?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm an educator, I'm a writer, I'm an author, many things. And of course, as an educator, I want this to be in the history books in schools. But it's not just us. I'm sure listeners and people who've tuned in will be aware of the amazing work Satnam Sangera is doing, trying to, re-educate us about the impact of empire, which also affects us as South Asians, so we say. And then there's people like David Olusoga trying to remind us that, Black history has been neglected as well. So in many ways, I'm trying to do a similar thing here with Muslim history when it comes to Europe. And you're right, there is a huge void. But I'm also very, I felt an urgency in writing this book because of what we are seeing. And what we are seeing, of course, we've all experienced. I live in London. Many of the viewers today will be from London, and they will know that only two months ago, somebody rocked up in our city, in the heart of our city. And he stood there and he told us that the problem for Europe is Islam. 1400 years later, we are being told we are a problem. Okay. And he also made it very, very clear to everyone listening that Islam does not belong in Europe. It is foreign to Europe. Now, this narrative has taken so much traction. It's picked up so much traction across Europe, because on my journeys, I don't just, go and find the Islamic heritage. I also find the anti-Islamic things, of course. It's picked up so much traction that only a few years ago, the far right marched through the capital of Poland, Krakow, carrying a banner the width of a huge street that read, "Pray for an Islamic Holocaust." And nobody batted an eyelid. Okay. Now, this is, by the way, Poland is a country where there is an indigenous European Muslim community that goes back 6 centuries. In fact, their narrative in itself, which isn't I allude to it in this book, their narrative in itself, had the Polish people who were carrying this, had they known this, had it been a part of their mainstream understanding of what it means to be Polish, might have been very different as well. And so it's the imminent danger, shall we say, the urgency of what we are seeing, how normalized it's become. And when I say normalized, I'm not just talking about rhetoric, I'm not just talking about discourse. You go into Waterstones now, you go into any bookshop now, and you pick up a history book, and you will see almost everything I've written is barely mentioned, if at all, in those books. 1400 years, and almost every popular history book tends to leave it out, except for individual academic types like Brian Catlos, like Maria Rosa Menecol. And look, if you're not into an academic book, that's not going to filter down. We know the problem with academia. It doesn't make it down to the masses. And so this is why I write this book in a popular domain, And I also actually I don't write with a Muslim audience in mind. That's actually something I consciously do because I don't need to preach to the converted. Yes, Muslims need to learn this so that we can maybe defend ourselves when things are being said to us about you don't belong here. But actually, the more pressing matter here is to make the non-Muslims ask themselves, why do you think you have this blind spot? And what kind of impact is this blind spot having on your perception of a Muslim without actually engaging with them? You know, this is this is where the Islamophobia comes from, Abdullah. You know, this Islamophobia. What does Islamophobia mean? A phobia means an irrational fear. So everybody talks about Islamophobia. Of course, what we're witnessing is anti-Muslim hate. It's far more than that. But the idea of Islamophobia is that people are irrationally scared of Islam. Well, actually, if you look at the way in which modern Western European identity has evolved through history, and this is something that has come about to me when I went looking for the Muslim history, this emerged from the pages. When you consistently see the way in which the popular domain has othered Muslim history, has neglected it, in some cases destroyed it, as I show in the book, okay, when you see all of that, you begin to understand why there's a quote unquote phobia, because it's a part of the DNA of what it means to be a European. Because the modern European identity emerged out of the medieval concept of Christendom. And the medieval concept of Christendom was anti-Muslim by definition. And so we start with the Crusades. We then go into the Reconquest narratives. Then we go into the anti-Ottoman narratives. Then we go into the colonial narratives. And alongside all of these, lots of other things are going on, which I don't go into too much detail in this book, purely because I also don't want to put the non-Muslim reader off and for them to imagine that this is some polemic anti-book about them. You know, I try to be gentle. In fact, I find it interesting that I was gentle with my first book, which really was very gentle. And, you know, here, come along with me and my family and come and see all these minarets in the mountains. Oh, and by the way, there are actual Muslim countries in Europe. And it was so highly lauded. It was long-listed for the biggest prize in nonfiction. Now, this book is being a bit more forceful. This book is pushing a bit more. And I think it's interesting for those of you that are online who have already read reviews in the major public newspapers. You'll see that pushback is creating a very different response. It's making a lot of people uncomfortable. It's going to be called controversial, because I'm basically saying with this book, I'm unashamedly not claiming to be objective, which is what they will accuse people of. Because of course, this is a great myth. This is the great lie. There is no such thing as objectivity. Anybody who studied this area of philosophy or whatever you want to call it will tell you objectivity doesn't exist. Nobody can be truly objective, because as the great philosophers have told us, to be truly objective, you have to extinguish yourself. And I'm not talking about that in the Sufi sense either. Okay, so you cannot extinguish yourself. So rather than pretend to be objective and pretend to present this kind of, detached, objective version of history, which is actually very biased because of the baggage you carry, I'm saying no. I'm not being objective. I'm going to try and be fair, but I'm bringing you the other side, and it's going to be heavy. And so, yes, you can accuse me of leaving this out, leaving that out, and leaving this out, which I've already been accused of by some people. Why am I leaving it out? Because it's already repeated in the history books 100 times. When you're trying to address an imbalance, Abdullah, when it's such an intense imbalance, you can't send a polite letter. You can't send a polite letter saying, please, can you just, fix this? You have to come with something heavy. Yeah. And so I'm not denying that, in this history, there are problematic elements. I'm not denying that. There were problematic leaders. There were even the occasional pogrom against certain minority groups. But what I'm saying is, this is what it does when you deny us this great history. There was a continuum break, between what we came and did for Europe, which is effectively resuscitate it at a time when it was on its knees, and then suddenly this renaissance happens, and we're not given credit, which everybody knows about. But then there's all this other very, very important history that has been left out. For example, the way in which, for 12 centuries, Muslim Europe consistently protected the most persecuted religious group in Europe, the Jews. Again and again. Now, we didn't just protect them. And here, of course, you'll hear accusations about dhimmitude and the jizya and everything, forgetting the fact that every Muslim has to pay tax called zakat. But what they can't deny, the naysayers, is that this was more than just tolerance. Okay, Abdullah, tolerance is when I'm sitting on the train, right, and somebody next to me smells and I'm kind of just putting
Yeah.
up with it. Okay, that's tolerance. This was more than that. And you know why it was more than that?
Yeah.
Because not one, but there was two Jewish golden ages that took place during Muslim Europe. Once under the Caliphate of Cordoba, and the other time under the Zirids and Nasrids of Granada. So this isn't just putting up with people. Now, when you take this history away, what are you doing? You're then leaving a void that others can come, especially in this day and age, because it's very pressing right now. This is the moment we're living in. Especially today, you have people coming back
Yeah.
now and telling you Muslims and Jews have been eternal enemies. Now, if this history was part of a mainstream understanding of what it means to be European or what it just means, world history, how would somebody like that be able to get away with this?
Yeah.
So these are the dangers.
The spot. No, thank you for no, definitely. I think you're right. The current climate, the rise of Islamophobia, the riots that we saw last summer, and obviously the recent protests, and obviously social media fueling with individuals. I
Yep.
think those are really, and that's why it's so important to always go back in the past. And this is what your book is doing, is reminding those who are maybe ignorant or those that don't know or that know but don't wish to acknowledge it, and all those within those three groups of category of people, that actually this is what has happened. This is how
Mm.
British Muslim, I'm not British, European Muslims have
And British Muslims in
made
that,
an
yes.
impact in society. For those that are listening to us live, please do ask a question. You can use the Q&A function, or you can ask questions on the chat. We want to get you involved in this conversation as well. I know you. There's so much you said that we want to unpack actually, which is really good because I think you went on like 4 or 5 minutes. In my head, I was thinking, okay, let's talk
Yes,
about this. Then
I
we're like,
do forgive me. It's also
no,
because of
it's
the
so fine.
delay, so I can't always read the responses. But there is a question in the Q&A if you want to address
Yeah,
that now. It's up to
we,
you.
we, we certainly will. I was thought, let's go into first question, which is European Muslim previously suffered a genocide in Bosnia, as we all know, for those of us in our lifetime. And I've just recently visited Bosnia in summer. With the rise generally accepted Islamophobia, are we at a threat of this again? Do you think it will hit the doors of Great Britain? Wow, scary question, but do you think are we on the
Yeah.
verge or are we
So,
on
so
in the
obviously,
remnants?
I engaged with this genocide in my previous book, and I go to the sites of where many of the massacres took place, and so I'm very familiar with it to an extent. But I'm not going to pretend to be an expert. But what I will say is, I think it's very telling that whenever we talk about never again, this phrase, whenever we talk about never again, people talk about that. People will go right back to the Holocaust. They will miss the other genocide. And this is the blind spot again. I keep coming back to this blind spot, okay? Which for me, it's caused by this anti-Muslim DNA that has evolved over 1400 years. But the blind spot is what means that this could just as easily happen again, as far as I'm concerned. In fact, one of the most terrifying moments on the journey for minarets in the mountains was when I was with this huge mountain of a man, as many Bosnians seem to be. He was one of the imams at the University of Sarajevo, one of the kind of teachers there. And he said to me, he said, Subhanallah, pray, Alhamdulillah, that this genocide did not happen now. And I said, what do you mean? He said, because I don't think anybody would stop it. And I'm telling you at a time when we've already seen this. Because he recognized that the Islamophobia since that genocide has reached such levels that Muslims can be killed indiscriminately, right? And nobody cares. And this is where I just want to point something out as well before we go to the next question. You see, this anti-Muslim DNA that I'm alluding to, this blind spot that Europeans have, you see, because it's not a modern phenomenon, you have to also appreciate that this has also been spread to the colonies. This is why we see it in the Americas. This is why we see it in Australia. And God forbid, this is why we also see it in the Middle East. Okay? Where there's a colony as well, of course. So this is why
Yeah.
it's so important that we ask the question, could there be something in the unconscious of the quote unquote popular European identity that creates this blind spot towards Islam? And if you look at the history, it's common sense, it's irrefutable. But of course, people who suffer from this, their immediate response is going to be defensive. Their immediate response is going to be defense.
Yeah.
Just like you and I. If somebody comes and says to us, oh, because you're Muslim, you must be, I don't know, the most popular line right now, you must be anti-Semitic by default, which is nonsense.
Yeah.
And we become defensive straight away, and sometimes we can't give a rational response. Okay. And this is what's happening right now. Because I'm actually asking the question, and I'm also producing evidence. It's going to be controversial. People are going to call it controversial, but I want to see people engage with what I'm saying and ask themselves, could there be any hint of truth here? Because just in the same way Satnam Sangera says, because you guys don't learn about what the empire actually did, you go around championing it like it was a great thing, and you don't even understand why all these brown people are here. Okay, so by highlighting that obvious blind spot, he's made a lot of people rethink. But if you see the hate he gets, not everybody's ready for
Yeah. I can imagine the hate that someone would get, and I'm sure you probably will get some in your way.
Oh, I'm already
But I
getting it.
hope
Don't worry about that.
you don't get as much as he does, because I remember. Are you getting it already? Hopefully you're thick enough and you're East London lad, so I'm sure you will be fine.
Yeah,
Uh,
inshallah.
I was going to ask this next question actually. I was going to ask this question in a different. What's the most unusual story you discovered while researching this book? And my question to you was actually going to be, what's the one the interesting thing while you were unpacking all this
Yeah,
evidences,
they're
researches,
both in the
stories?
same
One
category.
story
So
that picked
yeah,
up when you're like researching and
yeah.
go, oh my gosh, like the wow moment.
Yeah. So I'm going to go somewhere a bit
Go
lighter
for
now because this is getting a bit heavy. So one of the most beautiful moments, as with
it.
all moments when we go on a journey, are the ones that happen without any planning. And so I was sitting in the south of Spain in a village called Orhiva. Which is just beneath Granada, and it's where there's a Naqshbandi community who have rocked up there. And this whole area is alternative, but also the most fascinating thing about this whole area is it is littered with Muslim history, because it's through this channel that allegedly Abdurrahman I arrives, and it's through this channel that Boabdil leaves. Okay, so. Before I went, I had this kind of romantic notions of maybe coming across one of these mythical North Africans whose family still have a key to their home in Al-Andalus all those centuries ago, or maybe even some documents. And of course, it was, pie in the sky in the pie, or pie in the sky stuff. But anyway, so I'm sitting there, and these two individuals in front of me. One is North African, his name's Mohammed Bouleish, and the other one, his name's Sevilla. And neither of them speak English very well. And my translator, because it's first thing in the morning, he's clearly asleep. So he's not translating for me. They're having a laugh and high-fiving each other, and I'm wondering what's going on. And then he wakes up and he's like, oh my God, Tharik, you're going to be interested in this. And it turns out Sevilla, who's from Seville, and Bouleish, who's from Tangier, have forever been at each other's throats about which city is the best. And then what happened is one day, Bouleish's sheikh said to him, you need to find out who you are, because prior to that, in Bouleish's own words, he was a bit of a jahil. Not my words, his. Okay. And so he goes on this mission to find where his grandfather's tomb is, because he thinks that way he can, learn a bit more about his ancestry. And when he goes back to Tangier, to the region where his family are from, and he asks the people, do they know where this place is? They first ask, as you do, who's your father? And when he names his father, they say, oh, you are from Banu Lishbi. And he's like, Banu Lishbi? I've never heard of this. What is Banu Lishbi? So he phones his dad, and he's like, Dad, what is this Banu Lishbi? His dad's like, yeah, we're the Banu Lishbi. We're the tribe of Lishbi. He's like, what does that mean? And he goes, Banu Lishbi means we are the people who were exiled from Al-Ishbiliya. In other words, his family is originally from Seville. And so, of course, him and Sevilla is digging him out now and saying, I told you Seville was the best city. You're even from Seville. You can't say Tangier is the best anymore. And it was a great moment. They're having a laugh. But for me, it was such a magical moment, especially because I'd recently been in the, prior to this incident, I was up in Cordoba, in the Casa de Sefarad, in the Jewish museum, interviewing the people there. And the man there, the owner there, when I Sebastian, when I said to him, what do you think of this thing that Portugal and Spain, they're willing to give Sephardic Jews who can prove their Sephardic citizenship, but they won't do that for the Moriscos, because if the Moriscos prove they're from here, they won't give it to them. And he suggested that it's because the Sephardic, they're very kind of staunch on their lineage, and they hold on to it in such a amazing way. And I replied, have you ever heard an Arab recite his entire name? Lineage is very strong in Semitic people, full stop. And then to come and have this moment, unraveling right in front of me was really, really magical.
I think we just
If you lost me, yeah,
sorry, I
we can
think
go
we
to the
just
next question.
lost you for a
Can,
little
can you hear
bit.
me now?
Yeah, yeah, we can. Sorry, we lost you in the last bit. Around how the Arabs are very interested in lineage. Not interested,
Absolutely.
they know
Yeah, yeah.
the lineage very well, all the way to mashallah. I met someone recently. They know all the lineage to the time of the Sahaba, subhanallah.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
the dad has asked them to also memorize this in this day and age, all the way. I was like,
Mm.
subhanallah, how it's such an important thing that we sometimes South Asians don't do that well. Just on the next
Hmm.
question, what are your suggestions to highlight Muslims' contribution to modern Europe or Great Britain, to bring it into mainstream education, especially as a counter strategy to Islamophobia agenda or the far right or the rise of the reform and so on?
So, in terms of my suggestions, I think it needs to be more than one approach. Okay, and anybody that knows me, and maybe there's some people online who do actually know me, will know that I work in a variety of fields. Earlier on, you mentioned that I've created these heritage trails. You also mentioned that I work with the university to do similar work across Europe as well. What we have to do ultimately, the ultimate goal is to normalize it in the public domain, because what we're struggling against is what we call in academia the authorized narrative. Okay, in heritage studies, we call it the authorized narrative. Now, the authorized narrative is accepted as fact by most people, and this is where we have the issues. So, how do you challenge the authorized narrative? If you challenge it with fire, if you challenge it with anger, if you challenge it with anything polemic, it will be rejected. So then we need to do it with a gentleness. And of course, and then we have to, open people's eyes to potentially the impact as well and the effect it's having on them and us and so on. But it needs to be done with a gentleness, because nobody wants to be told that they are, in some way, I don't know, unconsciously anti something. Okay, it's like being told, "Oh, you're actually unconsciously racist." That's a very horrible thing to hear. Okay, and so this will also be a horrible thing to hear. So it needs to be done with a gentleness, and we need to do it across the board. But we need to aim to put this into the public domain, and we need to speak to the people who are non-Muslim. It's no good just, in our echo chambers going through
Echo
our
chamber,
reels
that's
every
the thing.
evening and seeing, someone in Bosnia saying, "Oh, look at this great Islamic heritage we had here. Oh, look at this," and for
Mm.
a moment we feel this pride and this injustice that it's all been denied, and then we swipe, and the next minute we're looking at a great goal by Ronaldinho or something, and then we swipe, and the next minute we're seeing a little clip of a comedian. This stuff is probably, look, social media has a massive influence for sure, but often social media
Yeah,
maneuvers in an echo chamber. Okay, so people who like this stuff are only seeing this stuff. So we need to take it from there and think about
yeah,
how can this have a real effect. And this is what alhamdulillah
spot
I
on.
tried to do in the various ways that I'm doing it. And in many ways, I don't necessarily think my book is going to have the effect directly, because people don't read. Not many people read anymore. Okay, but
I think we'll
the book,
contribute towards it
yeah,
without a doubt.
well, it's part of a chain. Okay, that's how I look at it. If you look at it
Yeah,
as a chain, okay, the links that I've relied on are the academics. Okay, I'm standing on their shoulders. I'm
yeah.
hoping maybe influencers, teachers, educators, others will stand on my shoulders. So I may not be the person that actively makes the change happen. I might not even be alive, but I'm starting a discussion,
Yeah.
and I'm saying there is a clear blind spot. This is what you've left out. This is how you've left it out. This is the
Yeah.
effect.
I think you're underestimating yourself here. I think you're not just in the chain. I think you're one of the collaborators of change.
Inshallah. No,
And
no,
I think
I'm
you're
one of the
playing your
links in the
part. And
chain.
like you
That's what
said, I
I'm
think
saying.
everyone plays
Yeah.
their part.
Well, I'm saying I'm one
Yeah,
of the links
everyone.
in the chain.
Spot on
Hmm.
chain, without a doubt, inshallah. The next question, in your experience, do you think the French Islamophobia ecosystem is a blueprint for Islamophobia in the UK?
I mean, look, I'm British. I'm barely understanding the kind of very localized British Islamophobia. There's no way I'm going to be able to give you a very definitive answer on the French one, because there's a lot of colonial history with North Africa that I don't know and I don't understand and don't pretend to. But what I will say is, above all of this, for all Europeans, is the Islamophobia that I'm talking about, which comes from centuries of crusade narratives, of anti-Ottoman narratives, of reconquest narrative, of myths and legends like the ones I talk about in the book of Matamoros, the Muslim killer patron saint of Spain, the 100 virgin tributes, these things that were taken as fact. They were the social media of the day. When these legends were repeated as fact, people began to believe that Muslims were like this. And what did they believe? They believed that Muslims were violent. They believed that Muslims were subhuman and worthy of killing. And they also believed that Muslims were sexually depraved. These are the two things we see repeated over and over again, even today in our tabloids. So it stuck. How did it come about? Now, obviously, on a very local level, there are other issues going on. The French-Algerian situation, which I'm not going to pretend I know or try to understand. Okay, the French-Moroccan situation, the Spanish-Moroccan situation, the British-South Asian situation. But in amongst all of them, like I say, there is an overarching European Islamophobia that comes from how the concept of Europa emerged out of the concept of medieval Christendom. People need to go and look back into this, and they'll understand better. You see, Christendom was the nations that united under the banner of Christianity in order to fight Islam. It is from this the emergence of the modern European identity. And yes, we went through an enlightenment. Yes, we went through a renaissance, a Christian renaissance. And yes, we have modernity and secularism and all of that. But actually, underneath it all is still that identity at the core. This is why you see some of the far right, they immediately start putting on Templar clothing. They immediately start putting on this medieval garb, because that's what sits at the core.
It's interesting, and I never thought about it like that, because when you were talking about French, I was thinking more about the empire of how the French, obviously, just like the British, ruled certain part of that colonies, and that was probably why that structural racism or structural Islamophobia has
Absolutely.
come about. You're going, no, actually, go back another
Yes.
century and actually look at Crusaders
What
and
informed
their
it?
thought, which is really,
What
really interesting.
shaped the colonial
I'm just
policy?
conscious of time. There's a really good
Yes.
question here, which is how can parents help their kids overcome the blind spot on this? Yeah. So I wanted to ask around, we spoke about a lot of blind spots. How
Mhm.
can parents help the kids overcome the blind spots on Islamic history of Europe?
This is a very good question from Mohammed. I can see it on my screen. Okay, the reality is, Mohammed,
Hello?
as a parent, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work. What are you going to do? Go and look up all the history I've looked up over the last 20 years to address this? It's not your responsibility solely. It's the responsibility of our madrasas, first and foremost, because that's the one place where, as a community, we can affect it. Okay, the schools, it's going to take a lot longer. We need policy to be changed. We need curriculum to be changed. So actually, as a community, the MCB, for example, as a body, we need to start putting pressure on our madrasas, first and foremost, to offer a much more holistic education, a much more wholesome education, an education that engages with the history that is relevant to us over here now. Okay, I'm not saying we neglect our, in my case, South Asian history. I'm not saying we neglect the Sirah, of course not. But I'm saying we need the rest as well. We need the rest as well. We need to talk about who these Abdul Rahmans were, because there were several of them and they did amazing things in Al Andalus. We need to know who Ibn Sina was, even though he wasn't a European. His work impacted medieval Europe for so long. We need to know who Ibn Rushd is. We need to know all these people. They need to become a normalized part of our discourse first. Okay, and that can only happen not through individual parents desperately trying to put things together, and it's just too much work. This needs to happen from our own educational perspective first and foremost. Our madrasa system, I'm really sorry, I know people are making a great effort, but it's a shambles in the main. Okay, it's a shambles when it comes to these things. Okay, I'm not here to talk about theology. I'm not here to talk about learning how to pray and all of those things. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about when it comes to understanding Islamic history, nurturing a wholesome Muslim identity. We are shambolic. Okay, we are shambolic at it, and so maybe it's not the parents' responsibility. Maybe we need to first and foremost. You're on mute, by the way, Abdullah. Maybe we need
Yeah.
to first and foremost address that as a community.
Yeah. So you're saying, as Muslim parents, obviously, as individually, we try and but also look at our internal systems and structure, which is the madrasa system, specifically, obviously, in learning history,
Mm.
and so on. I think you're spot on, as well as obviously, when you think about the curriculum. and books. What about books? So I know they've not asked that, but what advice would you give to your parents? I know we spoke earlier how books ain't a favorite kind of thing, but obviously people have the tablets and others.
Mm.
What books would you recommend for, especially for children who want to get into history or thinking about this sort of? Do you recommend one or two?
No, I have to confess, I haven't come across many children's books
Yeah,
in the
imagine.
mainstream about this kind of history. And forgive me if it's out there to all the authors who may have written those things. Okay, I certainly haven't come across it in a mainstream publication. Maybe within our own Islamic publication niche, and we both know that's a completely different world. Okay, I'm aware of it. I don't engage with it massively. Okay, but and when in that world, of course, a lot of our work is very well meaning, but if you're not a Muslim, it can be difficult to swallow because often it's very polemic. Okay. Now, when you come to the mainstream, a mainstream publisher will not publish you if it reeks of, polemic narratives. Okay, last night I did a book event and somebody asked me, how do you get published in the mainstream as a Muslim author? And I said, this is one of the main things when you're working with your actual text. Now, I don't see, like, for example, there's horrible histories, right? Which are brilliant history books. Where's the halal histories?
Oh yeah, horrible
Yeah, these
history.
are the books we need. Okay, like with
Good
my two
point.
older daughters, we would read these horrible histories all the time. But again, they're coming from a very narrow perspective. They're coming from a post-Christian perspective. And so, if I was to go to a mainstream publisher and say I want to, publish the halal histories version on that, there's a mountain to climb. So why are
Yeah,
our publishers not doing it? Why are our, because look,
yeah.
there are those, alhamdulillah, now that are emerging out of that
Alhamdulillah.
Islamic publication niche and trying to straddle the two. The
Yeah,
sponsors of this particular episode is an example of that. Cube. I've long admired their work. I've picked up lots of books that they've published and what have you. There are others like Beacon, and I could go on. Okay, they are starting to
yeah.
emerge. They still haven't made the splash where you'll find their books in Waterstones and whatever, but at least they're trying. And many of those editors, who I know personally as well in some cases, they recognize that in order for the non-Muslim to pick up their books, they have to write it in a particular way. Okay, and but what I want
Yeah.
to see from them as well now is I want to see that quality when it comes to children's books. Because let's be honest, it's too late for us.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's the children we have to save. And it's the children we have to give this to, because they're going to have to take up this fight. This isn't going away anywhere. And I'm sorry to use that kind of language, but what I'm talking about, of course, is this
Uh,
fight on a mental level. These, to use a horrific kind of term, clash of ideas, I think, is the one that famously was used by some of these people. But that's what it is. It is, but it's also about
Clash of
making those
Civilizations.
ideas. No, Clash of Civilization is another one, but there was also it's about winning the hearts and minds and all of that kind of
Clash of,
stuff. Yeah, there's that as well.
yeah,
And so I don't see it
that
yet.
one.
For example, I've told my agent that I really want to turn both of my books into a children's book that covers 1400 years of Muslim history in a comprehensive way, but for children, like the horrible history style. Now, we're going to pitch that to publishers, obviously mainstream
Yeah, that'll
publishers.
be
Whether or
amazing.
not it gets picked up, we'll see. But certainly, publishers seem to be receptive to it nowadays, a bit more mainstream publishers, because they've commissioned Satnam Sanghera to do something similar for British Empire. They've commissioned David Olusoga to do something similar for Black History. So you can pick up children's Black History books. You can pick up children's Empire books that are much more
Yeah,
on the, closer to the truth. We need the same in this field.
we certainly do, and I pray you or others, like you said, on the chain,
Inshallah.
pick that up and advance. I'm just conscious of time. I apologize, I won't be able to take all the questions. I thought I'll end before I ask for your final thought. I'll take one more last question. A nicest sort of way to sort of end off. What is your favorite European Muslim city and why? And you can't say Birmingham or London. I'm
By
sure
the way, I just want to I
I'm a
just want
bit
to address a
biased.
I just want to
Yeah,
address
go
a
on.
quick point that is at the end,
Sure.
because somebody has pointed out that there is the Project 1001 things. Okay, and I
Oh
think
yeah,
rightly so. That was a pivotal moment. National Geographic took the book on, and it became huge. Okay, and so what that book did was it basically did what a lot of modern Muslim Instagrammers and influencers are trying to do now. It gives you those lovely moments of, yes, we created the camera first. Yes, we were
yeah,
the first engineers. Yes, those best moments. Yeah. But for things to stick, for things to become normalized, we now need to go to the next level. And this is one book. We're talking about one book, and we're all celebrating that. One book.
Yeah.
Okay. So that tells you just the paucity of the situation, you know. So anyway, coming back to your horrible question, because whenever somebody says what's your favorite anything for travel writers, it's the most horrible question, because we by our very nature, we love almost everywhere we go, but for different reasons. Okay. But I guess
Just to be specific, maybe something a country you visit with Islamic heritage. Someone just wrote as well. So another question similar to that question that might help you in case if you're thinking like
I mean,
that's a
look,
difficult question
both
to
books cover tons of
answer.
Islamic heritage. I guess in many ways,
Yeah.
you know, I fell in love with Palermo in a way that I didn't expect, but for very different reasons to what you might think. I actually fell in love with Palermo not because of what all the Islamic history that I could find, but because of the echoes of it. So, you know, in my book, you see a picture of I think it's Ayatul Kursi still on the pillar of the Cathedral of Palermo, which used to be the great Jamia Masjid of Palermo. So these magical moments, but also what comes next. And what comes next is after the Muslims are essentially, shall we say, defeated. And by the way, the other thing that we should point out in our very Sunni-centric Muslim world is the great period of Palermo was under Shia rule. And that's something that, you know, a lot of Sunni-centric people, when they talk about these, conveniently overlook, including myself in the past. But afterwards, when the Kalbids are evicted, okay, what we end up with is we end up with these Vikings, or Normans as we call them, okay, who arrive in Sicily at the same time as the Vikings arrive and the Normans arrive over here. In fact, they're related, and that relationship in itself hasn't been very well. And they come across this fabulous Islamic culture, and they go completely native because they love it. Okay, and so they start calling themselves sultans. They start speaking Arabic. One of them, who I
Wow.
go and explore his heritage. You know, I go and explore some of the palaces like Al Aziz, which this is what he called his palace. He called it Al Aziz. He called himself Sultan Musta'iz, but
Wow.
his Latin name was William II, and of course he was related to William the Conqueror here. In fact, he was married to Joan of England. Okay, and Joan of England is the
Oh
sister.
wow.
Yeah, is the sister of Richard of Lionheart. Okay, yeah. So you can see all
Yeah.
these connections. They've never been explored. And that, of course, there are two reasons that I love this particular epoch, shall we say. One is these Normans, in spite of the fact that they were always at risk of losing their kingdom to Muslims, because that's what was happening. Okay, nothing about who was evil or anything. In spite of that, they really tried to embrace that culture of openness. And often what gets overlooked when we talk about in our circles about the translations in Toledo is the amazing translation work that went on in Palermo. So it's no surprise that you have these like luminous Christian translation moments in Toledo and Palermo, one in Italy, one in Spain. And where did the Christian Renaissance come from? Spain and Italy. Okay, so that's the first thing that I love this about. I love how you know, open the Normans were, at least the Arab Normans, to begin with. I'm not saying they were, you know, wonderful human beings or whatever else, but the other reason I love it is because it's an area that I'm, you know, I touch upon just briefly, and I think hopefully it will inspire others to look into, is the impact that culture has on Norman England, which has never really been fully explored.
Oh, wow.
And any kind of potential impact has been dismissed as, you know, nonsensical hearsay and whatever. So, for example, Henry II, a Norman king in in England, okay, it's his daughter Joan who's married to William II. So there's a relationship there. Okay, his ambassadors have been to Sicily. They've seen the glories of the Muslim, you know, heritage that was left there, the libraries and everything else. Do you think some books didn't come back? Of course they did. Secondly, he has a tutor called Adelard of Bath, who also traveled through Spain, through Sicily, because he wanted to learn from the Arabs. This is a quote by him. Okay, he wanted to learn the amazing knowledge of the Arabs. Right now, this might help us understand why also Henry II famously threatens the Pope that he's going to convert to Islam if the Pope doesn't go and do something about Thomas Becket, his great nemesis. Now, this little narrative, this little gem I've given you, is dismissed by popular mainstream historians of Henry II as being some nonsensical whatever. But when you put it into this framework and this concept that I've briefly given you a glimpse of, which goes into more detail in the book, suddenly it seems a little bit more than just hearsay. And that source that you get it from, maybe they knew something that others didn't want people to know or talk about at that time. The other interesting thing is Henry II is also the man who, before he dies, he establishes what we call English common law, okay, which is the underpinning of modern common law. And many legal, shall we say, individuals who study this, scholars and academics, have started to notice the familiar patterns in English common law with classical Islamic Sharia law, okay, including things like the Waqf. But the most amazing moment is this 12-man jury system, okay? Now, this 12-man jury system appears in medieval England during Henry II's time, just at the same time as the 12-man jury system was being practiced in Maliki Islam, which was the dominant Islam in Sicily, which was the dominant Islam in Spain, and had been developed by Maliki scholars 2 centuries before, okay? And this system meant that 12 people had to be selected to go away, assess the evidence, and come up with a decision, and they had to all agree before that decision could be passed. Now, if that doesn't sound like a modern jury system, I don't know what does. Now, the fact that it came and it was already being practiced in the Maliki world, which was intimately connected to the Christian Norman world over here, is something that's never really discussed in the popular mainstream. And I think those kind of things also is where, like, people are going to say, oh, you know, you're putting 2 and 2 together and coming up with 5. And quite frankly, that's fine. But let's have a discussion. Okay, let's have a discussion, because sometimes the parallels are just too much.
Yeah, that's amazing. I don't know about the Waqf system, and loads of people talk about that, how they've taken some of the best bits and kept it.
Mm,
But the 12 jury, that is spot on. Thank you very much. I'm just conscious of time. Apologies to those. I know there are a few more questions. We won't have time to take any more questions. I know you've been speaking quite a bit. We apologies for those. We wanted to unpack some of those discussion points. I think you've covered quite a lot of you. It took us actually on a journey with us, which we really appreciate. And for those of you that haven't, I put the link of tarikhussain.co.uk on the website. Please do buy his book. I'm going to be off to purchase one myself. So hopefully, when I see you in person next time, I shall get it signed so we can have it. But obviously,
mm.
share with others. I think it's really important that
Yeah,
we
yeah,
encourage more
yeah.
discussion,
I think
more
that's
books,
something.
more
Yeah,
literacy, and like you
mm.
said, spot on. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that's something
And
that
I
I
just want
really
to
want to
let me
say
give you
as
some
well.
final words. Over
Yeah,
to yourself if you want to just sum up. Go for it.
yeah. No, I
Go
just
for
want
over
to
to
end by
yourself.
saying.
I was going to say,
Yeah, I just want to end by saying that, often people will say, oh, Brother Tariq, you're clearly in almost like in isolation, doing this work on your own in this field and whatever. How can we support you? And to be honest, the biggest way that you can support me right now is to just, push this out in your circles, post on social media, put it on LinkedIn, talk about it, and just ask people to engage with it and see what they come up with. Because, look, the publishing industry is one that is not easy to survive in when you're a Muslim and when you come from the kind of working class and immigrant backgrounds that we come from a financial perspective. But I'm not going to ask people, oh, send me some money so I can go and write the next book or whatever. The best thing that people can do is put it on your social media. Just say to people, this is making us think. How about you? Do you want to have a think? This. Many of us work in a place where you might engage in a secret Santa over Christmas. At workplace. Maybe put one of these books in there for some of your non-Muslim
good
friends,
book to pass on.
because when they read it, it's not going to read like an Islamic book. And what I mean by that, of course, is a traditional Islamic book that in its kind of wording is exclusionary. It's not going to read like that. And anybody who's read Minarets knows that, because actually Minarets, and this is probably why the first person to put a question in there was, who is this writer? Actually, Minarets was read largely by non-Muslims, and it was appreciated largely by non-Muslims, because it's written with them in mind, and it's written with that language and that approach and that kind of gentleness. And so is this, but it's just not shying away from the history. But you'll see the delivery of the history when I'm writing it is much more gentle. Because we have an hour slot, I'm obviously being a bit more forceful here. Okay. But the delivery in the book, you'll see it's
Yeah.
gentle because that's what
No.
we have to be. So please keep sharing,
Thank
guys.
you. No, thank
Share
you.
about
Really
it.
appreciate it. Yeah, keep sharing. As someone asking how to best contact you, is that through your website?
Well, it depends really what you if you want to contact me for booking me for events. There's my agent or my books campaign manager, and they handle all of those things. On a personal level, you can obviously find me on social media and send me a message there. I always respond to DMs. So, for example, if you tag me on one of your posts, 9 times out of 10, I will reshare it when I see it. I'm not one of those authors who thinks they're above, engaging with not yet anyway. I'm not that famous. But on
They
a serious
forget
note,
about
I
us.
always reshare. And if we don't make a noise about the good work people are doing, and I hope you think it's good work in our community, then we shouldn't be surprised when that good work gets
Yeah.
extinguished. We're all, like I said, we're all a chain. I can't do all the amazing social media stuff some people out there do. So maybe they can take what I've done and do it with them. Because we can't do all of it. Then it becomes diluted.
Spot on. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your time and thank you for those that have tuned in. As mentioned, this webinar is recorded. It'll be uploaded on our YouTube channel. Do subscribe. Thanks to our sponsors, Q Publishing, for making this possible. You can stay connected with Muslim Council of Britain by visiting our website. We have a WhatsApp channel. It will keep you updated with what's happening. And hopefully, we look forward to having you next week at our webinar, inshallah, where we can unpack and discuss and confront, taking Brother Tarik's word, inshallah, and be confrontational and have those really important conversations. Thank you very much. Have a good evening and assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Take care.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you very much for having me on.